Our next session is entitled Rebirth, Reinvention, Return, Framing Questions for a Post-COVID World. The SNF Conference was born during a different, seemingly distant, but also destructive crisis, the financial crisis of 2008. Now we have another crisis of, one could argue, far greater consequences, the global COVID-19 pandemic. The current crisis poses many challenging and complex questions. What the world might look like and what choices we may face in the post-COVID world. How can we use, and if we can use this moment to build a better future? The moderator of the next panel is Andrew Zolli, Vice President of Planet Incorporation, forecaster and author. Andrew, over to you.
Hello and good morning and good afternoon. And I want to say welcome to everyone. That was an absolutely extraordinary conversation that we just heard with Andreas and with Bill T. Jones and Alan Stoga and Ruth Faden and Eric Kleinenberg. It's a little hard to follow such a powerful dialogue, but we have assembled here some of the most remarkable thinkers about the processes of social change and the ways in which change is both understood and then promulgated in the world, and several of whom are working at the very front lines of that. My name is Andrew Zolli. As was mentioned, I oversee the global humanitarian, sustainable development, climate, and public health portfolio at an organization called Planet, and it's my pleasure to be here with you and to engage and lead this conversation and help to set it up. So we're going to have a conversation today not about the next few months. There is extraordinary work that is underway in so many dimensions. There's so much change and connected forms of crises, as we'll discuss, that we wanted to take a step back from the sort of moment to moment of this extraordinary moment we're in, the tick-tock of this extraordinary moment, and look not just at the next few months, but at the next few years and even the next few decades, and ask how we might bounce forward to a different place. Explore the fundamental questions that society may have to ask. And in fact, the prior conversation addressed some of them. We will continue that conversation with my three esteemed co-discussants. They are Nicholas Christakis, who is a renowned social scientist at Yale University, and I'll say more about them. Hilary Cottam, who is a pioneering social entrepreneur and social innovator and author, and Aarathi Krishnan, who is leading transformational change in the humanitarian sector. To set up our conversation, I'm going to make about 10 minutes worth of remarks, and then I will bring each of my fellow discussants into the conversation to add and contribute to building a kind of composite picture from our various perspectives. So could I ask my colleagues in Athens if you could bring the slides up on the screen for a moment? Our names are there. That's great. I thought I would begin with my favorite quote from anyone. This is. Could you advance the slide, please? This is a quote from John Wheeler. John Wheeler is one of who was a contemporary of Albert Einstein. And he famously named black holes black holes. He was a visionary physicist. And he famously said, we shape the world by the questions we ask. And indeed, here today, I think what we're trying to do is not simply predict, but to ask the kind of framing questions and determine where we take a stand in helping to drive toward a better future. If you could proceed to the next slide. People say that, people use all kinds of metaphors in periods of grand and transformational change. They talk about revolutionary time and holy time. And I'm actually speaking to you today from Minneapolis, St. Paul, which has sparked a place that has sparked a truly global movement, and that is one of now the many global epicenters of this movement. When people talk about COVID, they often say things like it's a seismic event. And in fact, actually, it's worth noting that indeed it is a literal seismic event. Seismologists around the world were able to detect, as humanity began to shut down earlier in the year, the actual signature of that quieting of the earth in their instruments. So literally we see around the world, from China to Milan, from Brussels to Barcelona to New York, the literal quieting of the planet. And interestingly, this extraordinary new moment has occurred, in some ways connected to that quieting, which is a theme we may explore in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Today, we're here to really talk about a series of connected crises and how we address them over multiple time horizons. So we're really talking here about a kind of long emergency. There's a public health crisis that is going to be with us for at least the next 3 or 4 years. Even if we are able to create a vaccine, even if we're able to create therapeutics for COVID, we will be in a situation where we have to roll those out to the world, and where we have to tackle one of the most complicated illnesses that we've faced in our lifetime. Then beyond that, we have a 5-year at least economic crisis. We've seen this fundamental economic transformation and very, very deep spending, but we've also seen extraordinary economic pain. And in that pain are all kinds of questions about the relationship between individuals and the state, between people who are living in communities and people who are governing societies. And then we have this longer term crisis. It's an intergenerational crisis of confidence and trust and solidarity, and how we decide to govern ourselves politically. And cutting through all of them is this climate and nature crisis. We are living in the most important decade for climate action that's existed. So our relationships, not just with the health system, not just with the economic system, not just with the political and social system, but also with the ecological system, are all at play. And we've got all of this extraordinary buildup and pile up of all of these forces of change. If we move, this is a period of what we might think of as therefore kind of punctuated equilibrium, a period after a long period of stasis where the dam has burst and all of the water is rushing forward in a kind of extraordinary and transformational and revolutionary moment, potentially, in which the things that were long at the bottom are now being brought to the surface. And it's worth noting that the world can change really dramatically and really quickly. I don't know if any of you know what this is. This is the Greenwich Observatory in the UK, the place from which the British Empire measured the clock 100 years ago, literally 100 years ago. And what was fascinating is that if in the observatory, there's a giant map that showed how the British had a giant global hegemonic system on which the sun literally never set. It never set on the British Empire. And in 1910, if you had stood at the Greenwich Observatory, you would know that there was one global order. By 1920, after World War I, a fundamental and mortal wound had been delivered to that order, and the world would be irrevocably changed, but not after yet another global conflagration and mass conflict. So what's interesting is to think about the things that are happening and that were happening before we got to COVID, before we got to the beginning of this extraordinary year. One of the most important observations is that the world was becoming a kind of polarized place, not just within societies, but between them. If you look among the industrialized West for decade after decade, these countries that were the most advanced and quote unquote developed were the most optimistic about the future. But in the recent years, this situation has flipped. Now, the industrialized West has become actually the most pessimistic about the future, while the emerging countries, the emerging societies, and I use those words very carefully and understanding that they're loaded terms, have suddenly become the epicenters of optimism in the global system. And that was before COVID hit. If you could cast forward, please. And so what we see now is that in those societies, there's a fundamental loss of faith. And this is data that came before we saw the COVID pandemic arise, in which publics reported that literally no category of social institution is seen as both ethical, i.e. trustworthy, and competent. NGOs are seen as ethical, but not particularly competent. Businesses were seen as competent, but not particularly ethical. And media and government, which in an era of quarantine and mass mobilization have become essential institutions, are actually diminished and diminishing. They were moving in the wrong direction in terms of their perceptions of trust and confidence. And it's and both competence and ethical, their ethical stance. And you could see the effects of this, and part of the reason for this, and I'll speak to data from my own country for a moment, because this is going to be a global conversation. You could see it in the mass epidemic of the diseases of despair that emerged across the United States. Across the world, in every major industrialized country, rates of death from drug overdose and suicide and illnesses associated with depression and other chronic illnesses were all in the decline, except among categories of high school educated white Americans. Interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, 56% of those people said they don't believe that capitalism's working. The very systems that were put in place that promised a kind of better tomorrow have been broadly perceived as not working for a while. And of course, that's not the whole story, because at the same time, we also have to remember and see very clearly and bear witness to the fact that the global COVID pandemic is not an equal opportunity pathogen. It is not only disrupted inequitably, but it has revealed those profound inequalities, has brought them to the surface. And you can see it in the United States, for instance, where in some parts of some cities, like in the city of Chicago, for instance, 30% of the population is Black. 70% of the cases of COVID are Black, and it's become a proxy for long-standing chronic public health inequities, long-standing issues of economic equity, long-standing issues of access to health, wealth, property, and development. These issues must be addressed and form the essential backdrop for any conversation about what comes next. Now, it's also true that, as I mentioned before, we're living in this time of profound change just in terms of humanity's footprint upon the planet. And this discussion, in fact, this pandemic is an ecological problem as much as a public health problem. That is to say, it's rooted in our relationship with the planet. So what's happening between humanity and the planet? Certainly, it's the case that if you look at every single variable that defines humanity's position on the planet, it's moved from going in broadly a sort of gently ascending direction to a rapidly ascending direction. We've seen this sort of L-shaped curve in everything from how much carbon we put in the atmosphere, how much water we use, how many species we destroy, how many McDonald's restaurants, how many telephones there are on the planet. We live in an age of spikes. And part of what we have to address is our ecological relationship with the rest of the planet. You can see that today. Humanity has already altered about 75% of the landmass of the Earth. And in fact, we use about a third of the surface of the Earth for growing our food and cattle and feeding humanity. And this is all happening before the next billion people arrive on the planet. Unfortunately, that has put enormous stress on the places where wildlife live, and in particular, wildlife that carries some of the very illnesses, what we call zoonotic illnesses. About 60% of all the illnesses that humanity faces spend their life, some significant part of their life cycle, in animals. And as we put pressure on the land, as we put pressure on the environment, we create more opportunities for the transmission, not just of COVID, but of the next and the next and the next pandemic. So in addition to writing the relationship between humanity and the public health system and the political system and the economic system and the social system, we also have to think about the ecological system. Now, it's interesting to think about the fact that we have we've now given people, in the most painful way imaginable, we've actually given them a glimpse of what a lower carbon future could look like. And this is just one of the dimensions of change. So, this is a picture of Delhi before and after COVID. It's a profound, if painfully arrived at, terribly painfully arrived at experience. And what's particularly interesting about this is that our International Energy Agency has estimated that this year we will see, say, global carbon emissions drop by about 8%. Now, it's worth noting that even with all of the pain we have experienced from COVID globally, carbon emissions are only dropping about 8%. That suggests, for instance, how much of this is really rooted in systems that human beings don't control versus the kinds that over which they can make individual choices. The UN has told us, in fact, that we have to make a change like this, not just this year, but every year for the next 10 years if we're going to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And that's why the global financial system is beginning to understand that in this moment, things that amplify our climate risk are real financial risks. And so aligning these systems with each other becomes a fundamental question. And this is my last slide, and as a way to kind of get into the conversation with the extraordinary people that are my fellow conversationalists today. With these sorts of questions in mind, we have to ask, where do we go next? Where can we go next? If anything, the global Black Lives Matter movement and the extraordinary protests that we have seen around the world suggests an extraordinary appetite and hunger for difference. So there's a big question about where we can go and how that might be channeled, both in terms of policy and direct social action. We have to ask the question, how do we get there? And in order to get there, what do we have to remember? What do we have to forget? What do we have to renew? What do we have to reinvent or invent whole cloth? What painfully do we have to look at and see in order that we might begin to transcend that which we see and think about a world that combines those things we want to bring forward with those things that we need to leave behind? And so then I'd like to bring our discussants back, and let me just properly introduce them, because you are really in for a treat. These are some of my favorite thinkers and leaders in these fields. On the left of your screen, you'll see Nicholas Christakis, who is a renowned social scientist and researcher of networks and a physician at Yale University, where he directs the Human Nature Laboratory. And he's also the co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. And Nicholas is not only an alum of the SNF Conference, but he combines both a physician's and a scientist, a social scientist, and a network scientist's eye on the kinds of behavioral as well as the kind of epidemiological questions in front of us. In the middle of your screen, you'll see Hilary Cottam. Hilary is a renowned social entrepreneur and author who works with communities and governments around the world to design collaborative, affordable solutions to big social challenges. And boy, do we need those now, right? In this moment when it seems like the relationship between social services delivery and the people who need them is so profoundly on the table. Hilary's work focuses on the need for a fifth social revolution to enable widespread flourishing in this century as work and society and our economies go through deep structural change. And that's a biography that preceded COVID. So Hilary, I really want to welcome you as well. And then finally, Aarathi Krishnan, who has worked in humanitarian and development aid globally for 15 years and was until recently with the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, where she led the institutions and the networks thinking about the future, and has been on the front lines of conversations with communities around the world about how to think about the future, how to envision new futures. And for many of those communities, some of them, that was their first conversation about the future was with Aarathi. And so I think we're going to have a really robust conversation, and I'm very excited for you to hear from them. So I'm happily going to stop talking and hand it over to Nicholas. So Nicholas, over to you to lead us off.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's nice to join you electronically. I can't obviously see anyone in the audience, but
oh, we lost Nicholas. Oh dear. Okay. Because I think we're going to have to pull Nicholas back on the phone. Why don't we just do this in a slightly different order? And I will ask Hilary, if you wouldn't mind. Hilary, your work for your entire career has been in furtherance of reimagining the possibilities of the delivery of services, and you're back. Nicholas, are you with us?
I am with you. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Well, in the spirit of this, why don't we go in the original order intended, Hilary? Thank you for almost stepping in at the last moment, unless Nicholas is frozen again, which he is. Great. Okay, Hilary, we're gonna ask you to go first, as anticipated. So, Hilary, I think we're very curious about. Tell us a bit about your work, about the kinds of things that you've seen in terms of possibility. Tell us about the fifth social revolution. Give us a sense of how you see this moment.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. It's such a delight to be with everybody. It's always strange, as Nicholas was saying, to speak into this void. But anyway, I think the future is going to be about re-knitting and recombining things together in often quite sort of fragile ways, just as this call will kind of weave in and out. And as you said in your introduction, I have worked globally, but the last 10 years I've been working out of a small shed in South London with communities across Britain, looking at how we could basically reinvent a welfare state. How could we build with communities new approaches to family life, to supporting people with chronic health conditions, to finding good work, to being through those difficult teenage years, and then finally to supporting a good age. And we've been building new models that are all about human care and connection. And they're about relationships, really, and which I know is kind of really critical to Nicholas's work. I think he's coming in. Shall I carry on, or is he coming in?
Do. Yeah, please do, Hilary. Please continue.
Okay. So anyway, I mean, this work is really it has relationships at its heart, and about 10,000 people have used these different forms of kind of social organization. And I write about this work in my book, Radical Health. And about a decade ago, when I started this work, I would visit local leaders, local government leaders, and describe the work and ask them if they'd like to collaborate. So, for example, we have a service called Circle, which is a different way about supporting older people in communities. It's like a mix between a kind of concierge service, a social club, and a co-op. And what happens is it's fairly low cost. Everybody can join. We use very simple technology to connect people together, and then use that in the sort of back office, if you like, so that kind of real relationships can happen and people can support each other in all kinds of different ways and build genuine friendships. And I would go to local leaders and they would have a look through and they'd kind of look at the paperwork and they'd say, oh, yeah, well, look, this looks great. We can see this would really save us money because the health outcomes were great. People stopped going to their doctors just for a chat because they were lonely. Hospital readmissions stopped. But then they would always say the same thing. But the thing is, people here, they'll never participate like this. This will never work here. And I mean, like, nobody could say this now. I think that is kind of like one of the most exciting things about this pandemic, which is that everywhere, all over the world, we've got together and we've participated to help each other. So here in the UK, like in many countries, we kind of spent our Thursday nights, applauding for kind of key workers, health workers, deliverers, people doing the kind of, supermarket shelf stacking, all the stuff that's kept us together. People have got together to kind of, during Ramadan, to make iftar suppers, to make sure nobody is hungry, to get medicines, to kind of have a chat over the fence. And I mean, this is an experience of participation that changes us. There is no way now that we can go back. So for me, the question is, having kind of fought for this work for quite a long time, is now we've built this social infrastructure, it's kind of mushroomed spontaneously in streets and villages across this country and many other countries. How can we think differently about using those relational models to build something different? And so lots of people have talked, and you just talked so brilliantly, Andrew, about how this pandemic is kind of social, economic, but deeply connected to kind of the fact that we live beyond the kind of ecological boundaries of the planet. And that for too long, I mean, particularly in my world, we've seen social problems as completely isolated from these bigger kind of economic and ecological challenges. So people kind of have social systems and they expect people to have good lives, even where there's no good work to be found, there's not decent housing and so on. And, you know, obviously, we also know, which you spoke about very powerfully, is that this pandemic has not affected everybody equally, that we can really see very powerfully now the kind of divisions in our society, the kind of long-running inequalities, the fact that, you know, you showed those charts, but for so long, many of us have known that it's a myth, this idea of, by the way, I would like to know who in your slide is the informed public. I was a bit kind of worried about that we can come back to that. I think that's very interesting that you had public and informed public. But anyway, the biggest question then is, how do we make sure that we don't go back and we use this opportunity and this kind of new forms of social infrastructure and participation to move forward? And I think that those of us who have been lucky enough to grow up in Europe, at least, we've inherited these social systems that came out of the last big crisis. You know, in the post-war world, in a response to war itself, in a response to the deep economic crisis of the 1930s, in response to all the kind of problems of transition into, in that age, a kind of new technology of oil-based mass production, leaders got together and basically we had a social revolution. We had state welfare systems, we had the strengthening of the trades unions, we had the birth of the United Nations, we had the seeds of the European Union, and it changed our lives. We had good health, we had education, most of us had decent work with decent pay and good housing. But today, I think what's really important and what we're going to talk about today, I hope, is that these systems can't serve us because we face such different crises in terms of the technology revolution, the digital revolution. AI is creating something completely different. The ecological emergency, which is of devastating proportions and moving very fast. New forms of illness, which I think Nicholas will talk about, of the kind of body and the mind. Changing expectations, social structures, and so on. And we're also becoming really aware of how many were left behind. You know, you showed the kind of image of time, but also our welfare systems, particularly in the UK, have been built on the back of other bodies in other places that we can't see, and we have to have a kind of reckoning about that now. So in this context, I think we need to ask three big questions. So firstly, what is the big story we can tell now that everybody can reinterpret and be part of? We need a story that offers a vision of an equitable future, but also kind of very concrete response to the experience of unpredictability, which is most people's daily reality, definitely the reality of people in the communities that I work with, the people that Aarathi is working with, and so on. And you know, this is a pre-COVID norm I'm talking about. And Rebecca Solnit has written about the idea that we've had a kind of privatized heart, that we've kind of drawn in on ourselves. And I think we could start here with the idea of what does it mean actually to open our hearts? Because one thing we've seen for sure in this pandemic is that we are only as strong as the weakest members in our communities, that we are not actually individuals, that we are kind of deeply knitted together to each other as well as our wider environment. And we're also kind of, so we're bound together in that way. But I also think we can, you know, in this new story, I would say, I mean, in the manifesto, I set out some of the questions, but one of the other key things is I think we should think is, what is the meaning of wealth? So wealth is actually an Anglo-Saxon word that means richness of life. So this is a story as well we should tell for our social systems and our economies, like what actually is richness of life, all life. So then the second question is, having got this story, is how can we design a collective transition? So we need new social systems for transition out of this pandemic. I mean, we know we're going to have devastating unemployment, for example, but also into the kind of possible green futures we could have, where work would be good, where we would be thinking about kind of reproduction, reuse, you know, well-paid work within the kind of ecological boundaries of the planet. And thirdly, then, how do we address these deeper legacy challenges that I talked about, the structural and spatial injustices that have been left behind and weren't dealt with in the last social revolution? And I think that, the reason I'm calling for a fifth social revolution is we can have the kind of bigger discussion about why fifth and how it's kind of intimately related to kind of structural shifts in technology and society and so on. But I think the kind of critical thing is that we have to move on, and that those inherited institutions that we've got from the last revolution that are, very typical of their mass production era, kind of vertically organized, highly hierarchical. Mm-hmm. I know, Aarathi, this is your work and you're going to talk so powerfully about this in a moment. But these institutions, you're not, okay, but it's a good job I'm touching on it then, but these institutions can't support us. And so what we need to do really is kind of think about how we can have a revolution that tips things on its side and begins to, instead of kind of organize us in this way, organize us kind of laterally, heart out to one another, to professionals, to communities in completely different ways. And that is the beginning of the revolution. So in my manifesto, I basically call for a new design pattern. It's kind of a set of codes, if you like, that I think isn't going to be a kind of 20th century design blueprint, i.e. from the center rolled out to everybody cookie cutter. I mean, we can talk about scale and all of that, but I think that all has to go. It's about kind of a code that can be reinterpreted in each place, here in London, in Greece, where we all are, and then lead to a new kind of making. And so the final thing I want to say is that I think that this new code has to, at its heart, have a rethink about who we are as humans. So the last revolution was very much based on kind of two ideas that came together. One was the idea of Homo economicus, the idea that we are kind of, this selfish, rationalizing, economic man that just basically wants to kind of consume to the kind of highest level, which was knitted together really with the kind of Richard Dawkins idea of the selfish gene, that somehow, that society had this big problem with free riders, and so social systems in particular had to be designed to make sure that nobody was taking advantage. But what's so exciting now is that developments in kind of economics, in biology, anthropology, politics, I mean, Nicholas, his work is really important in this, have really shown us that this is not the norm. And that actually, I see us as sapiens integra, that we are people who want to connect. It's in our nature to want to connect to each other. We are stronger the more connected we are to each other. We want to work, to play, to kind of live lives with joy. So now is the moment really to ask that question. What are the social systems we could design that make us stronger the more connected we are? Systems that in fact are better the more people who come in rather than the more people we keep out. And that really would be a fifth revolution, I think.
Thank you, Hilary. I have 100 questions which we'll get into as we get into the discussion. But in the interest of time, because we started a little bit late, I'm going to take one thin slice of what you said, which is about tilting the institutions of governance sort of 90 degrees, right, and moving them from thinking in hierarchical frames to more sort of horizontal frames, because you couldn't ask for a better conceptual introduction to the work of Nicholas Christakis than that, who is one of the world's leading thinkers and explainers and understanders of how networks work. And so much of this pandemic, what's interesting about it is the ways in which it's blocked certain kinds of connectivity. It's literally physically distanced us both in our homes and from each other and from the kind of normative expressions of solidarity. And it's particularly interesting that about 3 months into that process, 2 or 3 months into that process, it all burst forth into the streets, right, into this mass movement, which was not particularly socially distanced, but was full of expressions of solidarity and shared self-care, shared care. So, Nicholas, why don't we bring it back to you? I'm going to cross my fingers to the Wi-Fi gods that we won't lose you again. But I'd love for you to pick up on this theme and talk to us about COVID and talk to us about behavioral contagion and give us a sense for your perspective on the last few months.
So I'm going to skip the preamble that I gave before and get right into some of the intellectual content I wanted to put on the table for us to have as background. And that is, as we all know, sometime in November, this microscopic invisible pathogen leapt into our species. And from the moment that it had spread to a goodly number of people, certainly by January, what I'd like to suggest is that our fate was sealed. Because this pathogen was experiencing what's known in biology as an ecological release. It was an organism. There's some debate as to whether viruses are living or dead, or not alive. I think of them as living things. It's an organism that had found virgin territory in us. It was having an ecological release, just like the rats that were taken to New Zealand, first by the Maoris in the 12th century, and later by the Europeans in the 18th century, found, terra incognita, and then did whatever they wanted there. There were no predators. This virus is like that. It's going to spread among us, and it's going to do what it wants with us. Now, this virus has some serious intrinsic properties. As best we can estimate, its intrinsic are not, that is to say, the ability of the virus to transmit and spread is about 2.6 for each case in a natural population that's non-immune and that has not implemented any kind of defensive practices. This virus will infect 2.6 new people for each person that's infected. That's actually quite high. For influenza, that number is between 1.3 to 1.9. Ebola is in the same range. Chickenpox is 5 to 6. This virus is quite infectious. And second, it's actually quite deadly intrinsically. We've had a lot of data now from the last few months. This virus kills between 0.5% and 1% of the people that it infects. Of the people that develop symptoms. So the case fatality rate, or the symptomatic case fatality rate, is about 0.5 to 1%. That's about 10 times as deadly as the flu. So we have a transmissible pathogen and a deadly pathogen among us. It was not there before. All our other problems, all our other causes of death, every other social problem we have is as before. But now we've added this other feature of our environment, which is this virus. And my argument would be is that there is no exit for us as a species, but that the virus become endemic among us. It will become like the flu, spreading among us and causing what it will do. And furthermore, it will do this in the next 2 or so years, whether we develop a vaccine or not. In other words, the vaccine, if we're lucky, will come in 2021. But it probably won't come in 2021, or it certainly won't be distributed to enough people by then. So I've stopped obsessing about when the vaccine will arrive. This virus, if you want to compute what fraction of people need to be infected so that we have herd immunity, the formula for that is R0 minus 1 over R0. So if you put in 2.6 minus 1 over 2.6, you get about 60%. About 60% of humans have to be infected before we have herd immunity. And it turns out that, actually it's a bit more complicated than that. Usually you don't have to have so many people infected, because if the popular people in a network are immune, they stop more paths through the network. But approximately that's the story. And so the point is, this is where we're going to get sooner or later. And if we develop a vaccine, then we can artificially immunize people. But if it takes a couple of years to develop a vaccine, then we're going to get to natural herd immunity roughly at the same time. So unfortunately, that is the reality that we are facing. Now, we're going to see the other side of this. And one of the things I'd like to say about this is that we have been lulled into a false sense of security in the last century, into thinking that what we are experiencing right now is so unusual. But actually, plagues are a feature of human existence. Plagues have always been with us. We have thousands of years of people talking about plagues. Thucydides, in the Plague of Athens in 430 BC, gives an incredible description of so many aspects of plague, including physical distancing, the death of doctors, the blame of outsiders. All of these features which we see today have been seen in human populations confronting plague for thousands of years. And so, so the plague is not new to our species. It's just new to us. We think it's so amazing or shocking what's happening to us, but it is a common historical feature. I'll say two more things, and then I'll shut up. The first thing I'll say is that we evolved, as Hilary alluded to earlier, we evolved to be a social species. Natural selection has shaped us to come together and live in groups. Now, in this book I worked on called Blueprint, I try to explain why we have evolved in this way and how we evolved to be good, how we have evolved to manifest some wonderful qualities like love and friendship and cooperation and teaching. So, for example, most people listening to this take for granted the fact that we learn from each other. But actually, learning is quite uncommon. Social learning is quite uncommon in the animal kingdom. I mean, any animal can learn. A little fish swimming in the sea can learn that if it swims up to the light, it will find food there. That's independent learning. But we also learn socially. So I can look at you, you put your hand in the fire and you burn your hand. You've learned something independently. But now I can learn something by watching you. Don't put my hand in the fire. And that I gain almost as much knowledge, but I pay none of the price. That's incredibly efficient social learning. Or you eat red berries and you die. And I watch you eat red berries and I learn don't eat red berries. That's incredibly efficient. But we don't just learn socially, because certain other animals do that as well. Certain primates, dolphins, elephants, and other animals, dogs. We also teach each other things. We go out affirmatively and teach each other how to do things, like how to build a fire. And that is extraordinarily rare in the animal kingdom. And so one of my lines from Blueprint was that we come together to have these benefits of being cooperative, as Hilary mentioned, and teaching each other things. But then by coming together, we also expose ourselves to the risk of violence. You know, I might harm you, or risk of infections. So I had this line, which was that the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas, which I think is true. But one of the deep ironies of the coronavirus pandemic is that to confront the germ, we need the spread of ideas. In other words, that we come together, and that's our weakness. The virus exploits the fact that we live socially, but it's precisely that we are social and cultural animals that we can beat back the virus, that we collaborate to implement non-pharmaceutical interventions, that we collaborate to invent vaccines and other technologies that allow us to beat back the virus. These are how the spread of ideas will allow us to combat the spread of germs. So anyway, those are just some introductory ideas that I'd like to put on the table, and I'm looking forward to participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Again, lots and lots of things to follow up with, and I know that we're already getting some questions being submitted. And before I hand it off to Aarathi, I just want to remind everyone that this is not just a dialogue between the four of us, it's also a dialogue with you, and we would love to hear your questions. On the screen, you can see instructions. If you go to www.snf.org/Q questions, you'll see a number of icons on that screen. One of them is a big question mark. That's where you click to submit your questions, so please do so. Now, before we get into conversation, I want to ask Aarathi to speak a bit. You know, it's interesting to hear both from Hilary and from Nicholas about the ways in which our connectivity matters and the ways in which we learn from one another. One of the most important things we can do is imagine together, and the act of collective imagination and thinking about not just the future, but many possible futures is something that you've dedicated your work and career to. I think we'd all be curious about what lessons we can draw for how we might imagine the future, or imagine many possible futures from here, from the work that you've done around the world. So Aarathi, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, Hilary and Nicholas. Fantastic introductions. So I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about was, you know, how do we do equitable social reimagining, and what does that look like? What I would argue in terms, and I'm not the only one that would argue that, but we could. One of the things I posit is that one of the reasons we are in the situation that we are in today, for the reasons Hilary and Nicholas very clearly articulated, is that a lot of the visioning of the types of futures we inhabit today have been traditionally imagined by a very small group of people. It's a homogeneous, normative, dominant vision that we have somehow throughout history very intentionally imposed those visions around the world. So when we think about what capitalism looks like, what development looks like, what does progress look like, we're almost quite we have blinders on. We have these specific ideas that are designed through a Western prism of what that looks like, and we impose that down. Andrew, in your presentation, you used the map of the British global order. And that was a really good slide, but also as part of that is the wounds that colonial act enacted on the world, and the historical, personal, social damage that has caused. And my second posit is when we're reimagining, we tend to put a romantic lens on this history. We derive these principles or these codes, or we just dismiss it completely. And so our imaginations of the future don't necessarily consider the systemic wounds that some of our histories have created and gotten us here. So I guess what I would argue is that we often think the future, and again, we have small groups of people that imagine it, small groups of people that, even if we look at who's in the panel today, we are a privileged group that get to come together to talk about this. I didn't grow up in Europe or North America. I come from the other side of the world, and have had a very different history and upbringing to my fellow panelists. And we carry those wounds with us, for those of us that don't fit into one type of identity, don't fit perfectly into well-defined boundaries. And so I guess the third thing that I would argue, and that I do argue in social reimagining, is very often when we do this, and the institutions that engage with us to do this, it is a tokenistic act for the most part. If that reimagination, and if you are lucky and you're good, you do it in a participatory way, isn't also integrated with how change actually happens, what are the levers we need to push at in order to make institutions and public good infrastructures change, then it is merely a tick the box exercise that we've said, okay, we've spoken to these people, and that's well and good. We make institutions, I think, and why a lot of my work links participatory social reimagining to institutional change within the humanitarian development space, in the social change space, is because our institutions are just not fit for it. We're just not fit. We're not fit for the present, and we're not fit for the future. We've seen it in how we are reacting to what has happened today. We are reacting to how many people have just been missed and slipped through the cracks in our systems, into the wounds of our system. Those wounds should never have existed in the first place, but it's existed because our institutions and the roles we play within those institutions assume a centrality of the status quo. So my third posit is, even when we reimagine, we somehow assume that the status quo will remain the same. And there's a point that Hilary mentioned earlier that I do want to come back to, that even when institutions therefore are thinking about, you told Hilary, your example was when you took your idea to institutions, and they talked about, but it'll never work here. We have broad-based assumptions we make about those whom we serve, very broad. And our identities at the moment are too interconnected, too interwoven, for those assumptions to remain the same. But again, when we have that centrality of the status quo and we cannot shift that, then it's a tokenistic exercise. So a lot of my work now asks, how do we actually transform our public good infrastructures? How do we actually transform the institutions that are meant to be serving us all and meant to be representing us? Because if not, change doesn't happen. It's great reimagination, great democracy of futures. But does it change anything? No, it doesn't. So I want to talk about the principles of equity. Reimagination has to be equitable reimagination. Reimagination has to allow all people to see themselves in it. And I guess I want to link it to a point that you made, Andrew, in one of your slides where you talked about the long now, and you talked about that we're facing an ecological, amongst all the crises, one of it is an ecological crisis. But I think one of the things that are missing in that, and we don't often talk about, is a crisis of belonging and a crisis of safety. And I come back to my point that if the types of futures we are reimagining and the institutions that are driving that reimagination are designing visions that I don't see myself in, that my mom doesn't see herself in, that my children or my grandchildren have no space in, no voice in, and don't feel safe in, then that's not an equitable future. So what I guess I want to end with, and I'm not sure if I've gone over time, but I guess it's that question about what kind of ancestors must we be? And it's not just about, it's much needed around the conversations of care and healing and how we bring everybody into the conversations. But it's also about saying, how can we better understand the wounds we have inflicted? Because we chose to not see it, we chose to not acknowledge it, and we chose to not move from our positions of privilege and comfort. And how must we now do that so that we are, I work in humanitarian aid and development, and we use the phrase leave no one behind. And I do not like that phrase, because it seems like an accident that we've left someone behind, rather than people are left behind because of the structural inequities of the system in the first place. And so the last thing I would leave you with, I suppose, is when we want to talk about the types of rebirth and reinvention of our post-COVID futures, we need to also consider, and we want to have that to be an equitable, inclusive, just, safe future for everybody. These words that are being tossed around now a lot. But what that also means is that we need to shift. We need to let go of something. For those of us that have been lucky enough to have some form of power or privilege or platform, there's something about us that we need to let it go. We just need to let it go. And what is that going to look like? And are we actually ready for that? And we're feeling that tension now in many different mechanisms, and people are angry and frustrated, but also scared. But I'll come back to that again. Are we ready to actually let something go that will mean that we might, so that we could create a world in which many worlds fit? I'll stop there.
Wow. Well, I first of all, thank you for that set of observations. And I want to ask you a couple of questions to all of you, and to remind the three of you as part of this that you are fully welcome to ask questions of each other, as this is intended to be a conversation. The first, I want to come to this question of agency and belonging, Aarathi, that you ended on. But before I would like to come back to it in a moment and ask a couple of questions at the outset, and just observe. I think you all know this, but I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we've had and seen a kind of fascinating moment where we have had the sparking of this mass movement, and one of the big questions is why? Because there have been killings by the police, for instance, of black and brown and indigenous people here, blocks from where I live, and routinely for many years, and yet this event was catalytic of some broader unlocking, right? And I wonder about the connection. First of all, there's a deep and profound social justice connection between this moment, the sort of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and the mass protests, and the COVID moment. And something in the alchemy of all of this created a moment of solidarity that I think is really fascinating. And I mention it not because it didn't stay local, it radiated around the country, our country, and around the world. So I want to come back to those questions, or some of those questions in a moment. But before I do, I want to ask a question, and any of you can feel free to pick this up, but I'm going to aim it first at Nicholas. Nicholas, one of the things that we see is a kind of fighting for a kind of metaphors, we reaching and grasping at what is the best analogy for COVID. Because as you noted, it's new to us. It's not new to history, but it's new to us. So, for instance, we've heard people use metaphors of war going at COVID. We're fighting the invisible enemy in the language of Donald Trump, or we are waging a battle. In fact, actually, there was the rhetoric of warriors, people who would take their masks off and go out and restart the economy. We used sort of laudatory and martial language about them. So but the interesting thing about a war metaphor is that a war metaphor implies agency and accountability. There are generals and there are people who make decisions, and as a consequence, if they're successful or they're not successful in implementing wise policies, they're accountable for that. Another metaphor is the weather, right? Like a big natural disaster. It's a hurricane or a typhoon that kind of blew in beyond anyone's control. And in some arguments about COVID, I've heard people say, no one could have seen this coming, and people are doing the best they can. They use the language that they might otherwise use when a tornado sets down in a community or some other big natural disaster happens. And those metaphors, that metaphor has a different kind of accountability. In your remarks a few minutes ago, you talked about the fact that this is going to become endemic. And in that sense, it may be more like the weather than like a war. Are either of these metaphors or neither of them right? And are there better ones that we could be using?
Those are all good questions, and they actually connect as well to something that Aarathi said that I wanted to comment on as well. No, I don't think we need to use those metaphors. I mean, why can't we just speak of it? It's like if you have a famine. If you have a famine, you would talk about a famine. You wouldn't say, well, is it like the weather, or is it like a war, or is it like a pandemic? You would say, no, this is a famine. This is a serious problem in its own right, with its own features. So, I think we don't need to reach for metaphors. We could just speak of pandemics. I think the nearest pandemic this is going to be like, I think we are, in the end, going to approach 1918, not so much in terms of ultimately the total fatality, but we're going to be between the 1957 and the 1918 pandemic. I want to go back to this issue of safety, however, because I think that regardless of where you are in the world, but certainly if you're in the richer parts of the world or in richer communities in the poorer parts of the world, there's been this sort of ascendant expectation about safety. And you see that a lot in the current generation that's used the locutions of safety as if the government can make them safe, or as if other people can make them safe. They make claims about safety against others, but there's nobody that can make us safe against the virus. The virus it has its own existence, and this idea that somehow, we're entitled to safety is itself a kind of an odd, very 21st century expectation. If you talk to my father, who was in his 80s, who was in Athens when the Nazis marched in and remembers the occupation of Athens, my father has a very different perspective on what's happening. Europe expects in the 21st century and since the Second World War that there won't be tanks on the streets, that there won't be armies moving through the streets and killing people with heavy weapons. Even that, incidentally, is a sort of interesting expectation. We've had years of peace during the Cold War, but, always with the Russian tanks amassed on the border and nuclear weapons and stuff kind of creating a détente. I think we've lost sight of the fact that there are forces vastly more powerful than us that make us unsafe. And I don't think it's possible to assure safety. And I certainly don't think it's possible going forward to live a life without risk, given the new contagious virus that's among us, at least for a number of years. On the George Floyd protests, I think the problems of police brutality in general and racialized violence in particular have been ongoing problems in our society. And I think that the existence of video footage, which increasingly exists in the last 10 years, and this particular case, which was so awfully brutal and unconscionable, and the sense of impunity that in broad daylight, we're going to murder this man in front of you, clearly played a role. But I think there were other factors. I think the mass unemployment caused by the coronavirus, the heat, the fact that we always tend to see mass protests more during hot weather, the sense of solidarity that Hilary and Aarathi both outlined. If it's the case that we can band together to avoid the virus, well, why can't we band together and address the police brutality? Or if it's the case that the state can act with such vigor and speed and allocate $2 trillion to stop a pandemic, why can't it fix police brutality? Expectations were raised, just like you highlighted, Andrew, about the clean air. All of a sudden, people had a palpable demonstration of clean air. All of a sudden, we had a palpable demonstration of government turning on a dime to address a collective problem. Why can't police brutality be in that category? So I think there was a lot going on that into those protests and that intersected with the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you, Nicholas. I welcome Hilary or Aarathi's response, and Hilary, I'll give you a lead-in question also just to think about. I go back to this question. So Nicholas just mentioned that we just saw this palpable demonstration that government, in the United States, for instance, has resisted the idea that we couldn't possibly spend money on universal health care. It's vastly too expensive. But suddenly we can spend trillions of dollars, with almost no oversight immediately to counteract the pandemic. So I want to ask you about this sort of space of possibility and kind of and how these coalitions form. That is to say, the kinds of work that you've done in building new kinds of social services and new kinds of social experiences for people. They receive, I sort of think about them like the kind of a glowing ember, right? You've lit this flame and you're blowing a lot of oxygen on it, and you're keeping that flame alive as you build these new systems, and giving just the right amount of oxygen, not too much and not too little, is critical when things are in that gestational phase. When you bring them to big institutions, they go, "Oh, there's no possible way we could think about this." Do you think that? Let's just start within Britain. Do you think that now there is a sense that the system needs upset? Has the political class caught up with the idea that fundamental change is both necessary and possible? It's the possible piece that I think is interesting. We suddenly have this awakening to the fact that our social relationships are arbitrary and provisional and could be reinvented. How do you see the formal system responding to this moment, and does the conversation around the kinds of work that you do suddenly take on a different, is it a new conversation now as opposed to before COVID?
Well, when you talk about the political class and our rulers here, I'm trying not to put my head in my hands, but
I'm glad he asked you that question and not me, Hilary.
I know. Have you noticed what's happening in this country? So
I have.
I think one of the really, there's so much to say about this. I think there are two really important forces. The force of participation that I talked about, that people have rolled up their sleeves and got in. And the other one is what Nicholas just talked about, which is that, we've seen that actually kind of long-held ideas can just be thrown out of the window within 24 hours and the state can turn and it can spend, and that's really interesting. I think that's something that is beginning to happen that is really important, which is also kind of relates in different ways to both what Nicholas and Aarathi have said. So one thing is that I think I have noticed that this idea of safety that Nicholas talked about is extremely class dependent. Like, I have noticed amongst I straddle many worlds, and I have noticed that amongst some people I know who have lived quite comfortable lives, they never thought anything like this would happen unless they are older people, like Nicholas's father or whatever, who have got that. Whereas, I live in Peckham, like my neighborhood, the communities I work with, it's quite hard to emphasize quite how precarious most people's lives are. So there was already no idea of safety. And, one thing about sort of Black Lives Matter and taking to the streets, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do right now in the UK, given our R rate, is that, well, it's already precarious. So what do we have to lose? I mean, I think that's really, really important part of this. So we're kind of in the balance between what might happen. I mean, particularly in the UK case, is this a 1918 moment where we don't do very much and we kind of push the crisis further down the road, or is this a post-war moment where we kind of grasp things and really begin to think about what we could fundamentally redesign? And I think it's really hard. We're kind of in the beginning of it. If it is going to be like the 1918 flu, Nicholas said, I think the second wave of that flu was even more deadly and destructive than the first wave. So we're kind of still waiting for more things to happen.
4 times deadlier.
It was. Sorry?
4 times deadlier.
Okay, well, there you go. I think it was really important to me that in April, the Financial Times wrote this editorial that said that we really have to rethink our social structures, and that what we have to do is we have to think about this not as a cost but as a moment of investment. And I think that is really important. And so the question comes, and kind of my work comes, which is sort of the kind of part that leans to Aarathi, which is, okay, but invest in what? Because if we just invest in the kind of systems that we already have, and there's a huge push to that, is like, let's spend on our post-war systems, let's spend more on centralized systems. I mean, in this country, we're kind of praising our National Health Service, which has completely failed. What's happened is that the people within that service have been extraordinary. But it's like anything really centralized, the supermarket distribution system or a medical system, we've seen that doesn't work. It's really shown up in this pandemic that doesn't work. So the question is, what are we going to invest in? And when we think about kind of digital transformation and the social revolutions that have gone along with that, what we see is that every time we have a chance to include more people and to rethink rather than just prop up the old systems. So what I'm really hoping is that this will be a moment to rethink that, we are all very connected, and so we can think about new social systems that really begin to kind of work for everybody, not just a few people. But I mean, what I would say about that is that you asked this brilliant question at the beginning, Andrew, and you said, you said, we shape the world by the questions we ask. And I immediately wanted to say, we make the world by the methods we use. And that is what's important, I think, now going forward, is what methods are we going to use to make sure that we hear all voices, that we don't try and kind of take that policy narrative that smooths out the uncomfortable voices that we're hearing that, maybe aren't what we want to hear, so that the kind of dominant elite narrative, policy narrative and kind of form of service can carry on, which I think is, the work that Aarathi is talking about that is so critical now as we go forward.
I think that's a wonderful bridge to what I wanted to follow up with Aarathi about. First part of this is about how I want to ask you about this process of inclusive futures creation, and in part I would like to ask you to reflect on what surprised you, because you're doing this work, right? Because so much of your work is about participatory and inclusive structures. And I want to pick up on a theme that you mentioned at the end of your remarks, which is that if you just engage in participatory futures, but you don't have an institutional commitment to transformation, it's empty, right? It's somehow it's a lot of talk without a lot of transformation. Do we need a new global humanitarian system? Well, one of the things that come out of this COVID system is a different way of organizing. I mean, you're speaking to us from Geneva, I think it's worth noting, which is one of the major epicenters of the global humanitarian system. Do we have to reorganize the way the work is done and delivered and thought about from the ground up?
Yeah. So a couple of days ago, I was on a panel around whether the humanitarian system was fit for was fit anymore. It's a conversation that we've had for a very, very, very long time. The panel was amazing. There were some huge minds on it. We had a huge amount of participants, and the overwhelming response was, hell yes. Again, and I guess this is where it's linked to my work, and the types of transformations I talk about, is we need an entirely new system, because the system is based on inequality. The system is based on band-aid solutions for things that are immediately in front of us, without thinking about the historical or ongoing or future systemic interconnected risks that are going to emerge. So we will work on climate issues. We will work on health issues, right? I'm being really simplistic here. We will work on migration, but why are people choosing to leave? I want to come back to Nicholas's point around safety. I don't think it's a point that anybody takes, but perhaps in some communities that I'm not a part of, but might take for granted. But certainly in my spaces, it's not, and that is a fundamental reason why people adapt and move and seek in their ambitions. It's based on historical understandings of what vulnerability looks like, and those understandings of vulnerability have shifted. We are vulnerable in different ways. It's based on this idea of the top-down white knight savior that has to come in and fix the problems in a country far away, without thinking about how they are reinforcing those cycles of inequality in the first place. This is obviously a topic I feel very strongly about. But in short, yes. How we think about public good, how we think about social change, the actors that get to enact it, the actors that get to design the policies around it, it doesn't consider, and it's failed to consider the multiple interconnected dimensions of how our world works today. And so it's narrow, it's linear, it's nationally fortressed, it's simplistic. We cater to donor grant funds and grant cycles, and I'm not taking away from how complicated it is, but it needs far more intellectual, systemic complexity rigor than we afford to it. I want to also just pick up a point, if I may, on your earlier question, which is around, Black Lives Matter, etc. I'm very, very conscious that as a woman of color, I'm not Black. It's not and I don't want to hijack the conversation, but yourself and Nicholas talked about, what has it been that sort of triggered this into a global movement. Yeah. From my perspective, it's triggered from a lens of being completely fed up of the multitude of violent aggressions and microaggressions that people of color, people that don't quite fit into the normative discourse, whether you're LGBTIQ, whether you have a wide range of abilities, whether what color your skin is, what sexuality, all of that, the anger of not saying that's enough anymore. Because you could argue, how has this reached a tipping point further, arguably, than the climate strikes did, or even the Me Too movement did, to an extent? What is it about this? Because this is something that we all, in whatever shape or form, have felt, and it's on top of your point earlier around the lack of faith in and legitimacy about the institutions that are meant to keep us safe and meant to look after us. They have failed, and it isn't just a Black issue anymore. It's an issue about.
Nicholas, were you going to interject?
Yeah. No, finish. I'm sorry. Go on.
Just that. I just think that I just wanted to come back to that point that it's what is it about this particular issue that has made it so deeply personal for people to want to make the decisions that they're making to go out and say enough is enough. And what's about this tipping point?
Let's only half the story, though. There's a delay, so I can never tell if I'm rudely interrupting someone or if there's a natural pause.
Please go ahead.
So I think that's only half the story, though, Aarathi, because the people that are protesting in an environment in which they expect their legitimate claims, which are wholly legitimate, to be responded to and respected. let's not forget that there are 40 million people enslaved in the world today. 40 million. And then most of the countries in which they are enslaved are in Africa, in Asia. But those countries are not protesting. So, for example, in Mauritania, in Mauritius, there is about 4%. They had chattel slavery until recently. In many African countries, there is various forms of slavery. In India, there's debt bondage still to this day. So there are many non-governmental organizations that are striving to address the problem of worldwide slavery. So like I said, about 40 million people around the world today are in some form of bondage. But those are occurring in places where those people do not feel like they can legitimately petition the state to fix the problem. So I think part of what's happening is it's not just that there are legitimate claims being made, but there are legitimate claims being made against entities which represent they will honor those claims. And so I think that's one of the reasons we are seeing this.
I'm sorry, Nicholas. I've got to disagree with you on that. I think the claim that that there's more slavery. I'm not sure if I just want to double check this to make sure I haven't misunderstood what you were saying, because I felt that you were trying to explain this topic back to me. Was what you were saying that there's more slavery in Africa and in Asia than in other parts of the world?
Yes.
And they weren't complaining about that? Or they weren't protesting against that?
Yes, right now there are 40 million slaves in the world, but they are not in Europe. There are some sexual slavery, there are some forms of bondage in Europe and in North America. But of the 40 million slaves in the world today, and you can find it, they're not in Europe or the United States. They are in Africa and in Asia. And so the question is, why in those countries do those Black lives not matter? And so what I'm saying is I agree with you in terms of the legitimacy of the demands, but I'm pointing out that those demands are only occurring in countries where they will be honored. So this is the whole argument about, well, anyway, so I think that's part of the issue. And so
may I use my moderator's gentle prerogative just to pull us out of this particular position? I wanted to just comment that one of the things that seems interesting about why this particular moment happened in this particular place, and the reason it became a mass moment, I think, is that I want to frame them correctly, the inconvenience and not the injustice. The inconvenience experienced by the larger white community here gave the experience of pain and disruption and that normally engenders feelings of pain, change and disruption are painful for human beings. The fact that people were in a place where they were sequestered, they were forced to experience some pain and disruption, and here I'm talking about the white community and communities of privilege, and the fact that they were not in the nature of their sequester, they were given the space not to be distracted from the injustice. We sort of were forced to look right at it. I think was catalytic, or at least important as part of the reason that you got this much larger movement, where in the past there had been movement out, there had been injustice after injustice and response after response, but not this mass moment. We're going to come up on the end of our time. We started a little bit late, so we're going to run a little bit late, but I wanted to ask you in kind of lightning form. So rather than have a longer conversation, let me just ask a few questions that have come up from our viewers. One of them is about the nature of public space. Obviously, we've socially distanced. Nicholas, you described the fact that we in some ways expect this to become endemic, 60% of the population to get it, against the observation that this is not an equal opportunity pathogen, and that people who are already vulnerable and made vulnerable by these systemic inequities are likely to bear the brunt. One of the questions is, and I'd just like to ask you all quickly to respond to this, is do we need to redesign our public spaces, and do we have to take compensatory action to protect, to address the systemic inequities now, so that if we have to get to something like herd immunity, which you mentioned, Nicholas, that we get there in a way that is not born solely or even principally on one or a small specific group of people who are already kind of structurally disadvantaged in the context of that spread. So let me just ask you about public space and about compensatory measures we might take. And Nicholas, you'd like to go first, and then we'll go right.
I mean, I think one of the things the pandemic has done is that it's highlighted the kinds of global inequalities and longstanding inequalities that Aarathi was already pointing out. So infectious disease, or disease in general, has always fallen disproportionately on the disenfranchised, the poor, the chronically ill, the imprisoned, the institutionalized, and it's appalling. I mean, it's unjust and it's wrong. But this has always been the case about disease in general and infectious disease in particular. And I think one of the things that's so interesting, and here I'm inspired by Paul Farmer's work, is why the narrative is about disease control rather than care. Why is it control rather than care? Why aren't we caring for sick people? Or even why, I love this idea, we talk about these as emerging diseases. Emerging from where? Upon whom? Right? Usually these are seen as diseases that come from the dark parts of the world, and then only when they affect us, now we're all of a sudden they've emerged, and we're concerned about them, right? Which is exactly wrong, right? We need to be concerned about these diseases because they affect human beings. And so the issue is, for me, is not so much whether we must struggle to redress some of these injustices and inequalities. It's how are we going to use this, yet again, powerful opportunity to further that important work of the cause of justice.
I appreciate it, Nicholas. Let me just ask you just specifically to address this question of public space. Will the legacy of COVID lead to different, do you think we might live in a slightly different physical landscape? We're already, people are starting to go to restaurants and sit, several tables apart from each other. That sounds like a new design context, for instance, for public life.
I think we'll do that for 5 years. I think we're going to have 2.5 years before we reach either herd immunity or a vaccine, whichever comes first. And then we'll have 2.5 years of people being skittish. They won't quite believe that it's sort of safe to go out. And then I think we're going to have a period like the Roaring '20s afterwards, where people feel I survived, or we made it, or we've had enough of this, and we will have a period of kind of efflorescence of arts, of licentiousness, I think, of spending. We're going to see a kind of a change. But I think we're going to have the acute shock, which we're still in, and more death to come, much more death. And then we're going to have about 2 years, I think, of, my God, I can't believe what just happened. And then I think in 5 years, we'll return to the normal restaurants and public spaces.
Hilary, I'd love your perspective. Thank you, Nicholas. Hilary, could you give us a perspective? What do you? I mean, because I think of you as a social designer.
Yes. Well, but I think this is a really important question because I think it brings us back to the kind of bigger question we're having about rebirth and reinvention. And I think that this pandemic, as awful as it is, and it is a terrible time of kind of loss and sorrow, I think that's really important. And Nicholas is saying that even more is going to come. But really, it's just a warm-up act, actually, for the kind of bigger crisis of climate change. And it is also a wake-up call of the much deeper kind of social tensions of inequality and injustice. So I think we definitely must redesign our public spaces because we have got all of those problems designed into them. They're kind of inequitable, they're kind of not healthy. So I think let's seize the moment, not because of the pandemic. One of the most important things we could do is we could design relationships, ironically, into our social spaces. We could design in kind of ways to encounter one another. We could design in, when I work with older people, the biggest crisis is there are no longer any public toilets, so you can't go out. So this is a kind of, obviously runs completely in the counter to what we need right now to kind of manage the pandemic in the way that Nicholas is talking about. But so this is, and so I think it's a really good question because it goes to the heart of the issue. Are we going to kind of take the big picture and think about where we need to go for our long-term health and wealth, and I mean that in the kind of richness of what a society can be and what life and natural life can be, we need to redesign our public spaces, but perhaps with that bigger picture in mind, not with the immediate kind of like, am I going to infect Nicholas question in mind.
And Aarathi, I'd love to ask you the same thing. And in particular, I wonder about, the role of design as a means of thinking about the future. Like kind of, I know in some of your work, you've actually used design to kind of provoke new kinds of thinking. Do you have a perspective on the pub-based question and about the role of design in thinking about the future?
In short, yes, I think our public spaces absolutely do need to be redesigned. I think we're already seeing examples of this. We've seen it in Amsterdam, we've seen it in Milan. We're sitting here right outside my street where they're making it narrower and so that there's less cars that can go through, etc. So we can have more cyclists. It's very controversial here in Geneva. But yes, absolutely. I think it's also, as Hilary said, and I wholeheartedly agree with her, is the spaces and how we can use this to also reform our social contract with each other and how we connect and talk. And in design, absolutely. Design and foresight and innovation and experimentation and strategy, they all go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. And I think the limitations of our minds and our capacities is when we do it, when each of this practice thinks they have the answer by themselves. And what I hope this pandemic has forced us to see is that, without using the same old boring language of collaboration, of partnership, but that we need very diverse minds and perspectives and practices and philosophies in order to, as Hilary and Nicholas have said, this is just the start. We know we've got way more ahead of us and we can't solve it just thinking we're the only experts. So it's the design. What I hope to see is what I'm loving seeing is how we are challenging our own notions of expertise and how we are shifting to more of a learning lens in how we reshape these futures ahead of us.
I want to thank you. There are dozens of subjects we could not possibly have gotten to, and many questions we'll have left on the table. But the question that I'm left with in listening to all three of you is really about it's a question about dialectic. In ways you have all implicated this set of questions about moving forward to a new equilibrium or a new place of homeostasis, some new set of possible futures. And the metaphor that I think about is when the car goes off the road, in the car there might be a point of view that the right way to move forward out of the ditch is to kind of push through to the next lane, is to sort of push through to the next place. But it's equally reasonable to think that the way to get out of the ditch is to back up. And of course, the way in which you always get out of a ditch is you rock the car back and forth. That is to say, you move forward to some new equilibrium and you go backwards to remembering the things that you want to bring forward with you into that new equilibrium. And in that dialectical process, something new is created, and hopefully the car begins to move. And I think in this conversation, you've given us a ton to think about how we engage in those processes. And for everyone who asked a question we didn't get to, I really appreciate it. You're asking, please continue to follow these wonderful thinkers. And to all three of you, I want to say thank you on behalf of the foundation and on behalf of all of the audience, and most importantly, on behalf of myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great.